I'm not going to use that microphone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Great. Usually that's the answer. So this is being recorded, so the pressure's on, and there's a microphone here. I was telling Pauline earlier that driving up here this evening reminded me that I'm a product of the school system in this area. I went to elementary school at H.O. Sonneson Elementary, and a number of years ago. Deathly afraid of public speaking, I can tell you. But I seem to have shaken that fear over the years. I've given a version of the presentation I'm going to give you tonight probably a couple dozen times over the last couple of years. And usually the audience is there because their job requires them to be there. They get continuing education credits because they have to go to conferences. So last Friday I was in Duluth at the American Water Works Association conference. It's all the public works directors, the water supply folks, the people that provide and manage the system that brings water to our homes and our businesses. Tomorrow I'm driving up to Virginia in the morning to talk at Giants Ridge to a group of planning and zoning administrators about how what they do influences our water quality and our water abundance. So it's unusual for me to get the chance to just talk to sort of average Joe citizens. And I'm really, and I don't mean that disparagingly, because in fact, as your mission and your mantra says, you're getting educated because you want to shape policy, and I think that's a fabulous thing. Let me start off by saying that when it comes to our water supply, unlike California, we're not in the emergency room, if you will, but we are in an urgency room. And I hope that the information I share with you tonight helps you understand the urgent aspects of both our water quantity and our water quality. But when we recognize that where we are, we're pretty early in the process of being able to make subtle shifts and changes that can really shape the future. I went to college in California. I know quite well what some of their water policy issues are and some of the resource issues are. And you know, this train's been coming down that track for a very long time, what they're dealing with now. Stimulated and spurred by drought just made it more acute, but it's been a chronic challenge. And they've recently enacted some laws that will take effect over the next 20 years. Those laws will get them about where we are today. So why do I have a stream picture on a slide about groundwater? Anybody want to hazard a guess?
That's where the groundwater, that's where the water ends up, in the ground.
That's right. This is a stream that is entirely dependent on groundwater. Without groundwater, this stream doesn't exist. And without that groundwater, this is not a premier trout stream, which it is, in southeastern Minnesota. This is called Trout Run Creek. Destination place for trout anglers, people that want to go out and connect with their environment. When I was a kid growing up here in Crystal, we used to hike our way or bike our way to the nearest pond and catch whatever fish we could catch. And that's when I grew to appreciate the opportunity and the access we have and the tremendous water resources we have in the state, which Pauline was asking me, why did I get into the field that I got into? And that's where it all started. And it's for me, an incredibly rewarding career and opportunity, and I love to get up and talk to people about that and about what we're doing. So with that, let me do this. There's kind of three parts or so to this presentation. The first part is I'm going to give you some information, basically trend data, things that we're learning to help you understand why is groundwater at risk of overuse and contamination, and what do we mean by that? Okay, so that's the first part. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about our water law in the state, because it's really fundamental that we understand how we're different from Western states, and how that plays out in terms of the way water gets used. And at the end, I'm going to talk about things that we can do, things that you can do individually, things that you can lean on policymakers to do more at a sort of a larger level, at a community level, or at a statewide level. And I'm going to give you a couple, just maybe one example of a community. I have others examples, but we won't have time to get into them tonight. Okay, so let me start with this. We're using more groundwater than ever before in the state of Minnesota. On average, what this graph shows is that we use about 3 billion gallons more each year of groundwater. Our use fluctuates. You can see that right from that blue line. It fluctuates because whether or not it rains really drives how much water we use that we pump, whether it be from the river or from groundwater. In this case, I'm just showing you groundwater, okay? This is how we use it. So this is a 5-year average. And in our state, about 34%, so roughly a third, of the water we pump out of the ground goes towards crop irrigation. Corn, beans, rice, other crops, potatoes, etc. A little over half goes to our water supply systems. So those would be your community water supply systems for the most part. A very, very tiny fraction goes to power generation. We use a tremendous amount of surface water to generate electricity and to cool our power plants, but we use very little groundwater for that purpose. Industrial processing is about 8%. And then there's this other category which captures most everything else. Now, what I want to say is that these two categories are the ones that are contributing to all that growth. The other ones are flat. Industrial processing water use, reported use, is actually declining slightly over time. The other two categories, these two, are the ones that are growing. And if we look at our water supply systems, on average, about a third of the water that we distribute to businesses and homes gets used outside the home. Come on in, take a seat. About a third of that water gets used for what I'd call urban irrigation. So we're irrigating our urban landscape, our lawns, our gardens, our parks, our ball fields, that sort of stuff. We're going to come back to that. Every county in the state of Minnesota has a community that is relying on groundwater to meet its public water supply. Some more than others. I'm not going to get into the variability of our state. We've got some maps over here you can look at, but northeastern Minnesota is hard rock, very hard rock, not really good for yielding water. But along the Iron Range, we have iron pits, and then there tends to be water that accumulates. But if you look at the density around the metro, you can see that this is critically important to our businesses, our economy, our homes, our health, etc. We also see how much groundwater is now contributing to and needed for agricultural irrigation. And it tends to be concentrated. You can see that by the green dots and the red dots. Red dots are non-crop irrigation. Green dots are the major crop irrigation. So some patterns start to emerge that we tend to use this not distributed around the state, but in concentrated places. What drives that is typically the soils. If it's sand and gravel, it doesn't hold a lot of water, so if it doesn't rain every few days, you got to put some water on it for your crops to have water. This is a little movie, and it'll just cycle through here from 1988 through 2000, and I think 13 or 14 is the last year of data here. What this is representing the density of high volume, high capacity wells. So again, just kind of shows you a pattern, right? Around the Twin Cities, we have a high density of wells that pump a lot of water. In these parts of the state, it's largely agricultural irrigation. Part of this is just to convey how this is changing over time. From 1988 to now, a lot more wells pumping water out of concentrated zones. And one of the things that we're tasked with at the DNR is to, and I'll talk more about this, we permit that use of water, and we have to make sure it doesn't impact resources, surface water resources. And one of the things that we've done is to look at the amount of water that's falling in a given landscape and how much of that water are we actually pumping and consuming. Now, by consuming, I mean water that's taken out and not returned to that same place. So you take it out, you bring it into your home, you use it for your laundry, your toilets, and all these. Well, that goes into a pipe, and it doesn't go necessarily into septics, but into here. It goes into a waste treatment facility, and then we're discharging it now into the river. Okay? If it's agricultural irrigation, the vast, vast majority of that water that gets applied on that field is evaporating through the plants back up. And if it's not, that's a cost to that producer because they're going to not only lose water that they pumped and they had to pay for, but they're going to lose their fertilizer if it's moving down through the soil profile. So they want to put on just enough. So what this map is showing is some really intensively used areas. A high percentage of that water is being consumed. And so for us, it's a matter of, are we overusing it? Or are we at risk of overusing, right? That's where we started. What's the risk of overuse? Well, we're using it intensively. There are rivers, there's wetlands, there's streams. There are surface water features throughout this landscape that are connected to these groundwater resources. And our job is to evaluate that, understand it, and figure out how and if we're managing it sustainably. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. One other trend that we know is that agricultural irrigation is on the rise across the state. You ever driven through Nebraska? Anybody? You don't see a crop without irrigation. They just don't have the moisture, right? Well, in Minnesota, that's not true. You can drive through a lot of our farmland and there's not irrigation pivots. Only about 3% of our cropland is irrigated, but it's extremely important to those places in that sand and gravel soils or for their certain specialty crops that they have this regular supply of water that they can apply and count on, depend on. But it's definitely going up over time. And when we look at the number of permits that we've been getting over the last few years, that's these two bars. You know, we were down here at, for long-term historically, we were actually at about 50 new permits a year. Then it went up in 2008, kind of bounced around. Boom, big spike in 2013 and 14. There are a variety of reasons. Commodity prices were really good, so producers had money to invest back into their production systems. There was also concerns that people wanted to make sure they got their permits before things changed because we were talking a lot about water. So a lot of factors, but it's not just ag, okay? Ag is the dark. Total water use means we're also getting new applications for municipalities, for industry and businesses, etc. It's not just agriculture. All right, well, this one's going to start to touch home a little bit for you folks. Chloride is now showing up in our shallow groundwater more and more and in higher concentrations. When we start to get to this, 250 milligrams per liter of chloride in our water, that's toxic to aquatic life. Now we're impacting whatever insects, fish, things that are in the streams or wetlands. And if we're getting that in our groundwater, you can imagine what it is in the surface water, right? Because it's filtering down through into the groundwater. And there's a lot of, this is from the PCA, but there's a lot of red right here in the Twin Cities, and even some of this olive green and so forth. But it also shows up in the places where we have a lot of this sand and gravel, and that's what some of this light shading is representing here on the map. Shows up where we have a high density of road networks and where we have a lot of sand and gravel, and the single largest source is road salt. Running off, going into the landscape, and then infiltrating down into our groundwater. The other one, the public health issue, is that we got a lot of nitrate showing up in our groundwater. Whenever you drill a new well in the state of Minnesota, you have to take a water sample, and it gets analyzed. The Department of Health does a test to find out what's in it. They test it for bacteria and other things, but they test it for nitrate. Folks familiar with blue baby syndrome, what the concern is? If you have high nitrates in your water supply, those nitrates interfere with the hemoglobin's ability to carry oxygen, and then therefore the body is starved of oxygen, even though you might be breathing it in just fine, but it's not circulating through because it's interfered with. So anything over 10 milligrams per liter, that's considered the health risk limit by the EPA. You don't want to feed that to infants for sure, or pregnant women. Most of the rest of us could tolerate it, and then nitrate will actually make the water taste pretty good. But nevertheless, we've got a lot of places around the state with red and even some of these other colored greenish dots that are more nitrate than would have been found there naturally. And the single biggest source of that nitrate is agricultural fertilizer. And what happens is that when you put your fertilizer on your fields, you can't predict when the rains are going to come and how much rain's going to come. And, you know, if you get a half an inch of rain, the soil will absorb that half inch of rain and it won't get past the root zone. But when you get a 2 or a 3 inch rain, it can't absorb it all, and that water will infiltrate, and nitrate is soluble in water, so it just migrates down through the soil, past the root zone, and now it's lost, and it ends up in our shallow groundwater. and eventually maybe in our deeper aquifers. So the Department of Agriculture is tasked with trying to wrestle this problem, and they've got a nitrogen fertilizer management plan, and they're working on intensively sampling some of these areas to get a better handle on what's happening, what the trends are, and how to work with agricultural producers to reduce the risk of this continued contamination of groundwater through nitrate. But nitrate, when it's in a community water supply well, becomes very expensive to treat. The city of St. Peter had to build a very expensive filtration system. The city of Park Rapids up here, nitrates were in that system, so they went to a different aquifer, but that aquifer had other problems, so they had to build a treatment system for that. Either way, they were going to have to build a treatment system. So it adds cost. Those costs get passed on to the consumers. All right, so I talked about contamination. I'm going to talk a little bit about water level trends in the state of Minnesota. This is a map. This is a very challenging thing to try to explain and to display, so bear with me here for a moment. It doesn't quite show up as yellow, but you see these sort of, I don't know, olive green shaded colors here scattered throughout the state. Those represent places where we've had 20 years of data, we've done a statistical analysis, and the water level is statistically on a downward trend. Okay, it's going down. If there's a blue dot, that means that the data there indicate the water level is actually on a rise for that monitoring site. And if it's kind of this grayish, that means it's just no trend at all. It's not going up, it's not going down, but it's just kind of hanging there. So you're all looking at that going, well, what do you make of that, right? So here in the center part of the state, about a third, 63 out of the 185 sites have a downward trend, but the others don't. And start looking at a spot like right here, you've got it's downward and then it's flat, or here it's down and there it's flat. It's pretty mixed. And that's just because of the way we use the water and the aquifers and the interactions. We're trying to get a better handle on it. But what I would leave you with from this slide is that it's important to recognize that this is 20 years of data. These are the only places where we have 20 years of data. Look where we don't. A lot of Minnesota doesn't have even 20 years of data. And groundwater is very slow moving compared to a river or a stream. You know, we're talking inches, you know, a year in some cases, whereas, you know, streams are moving feet per second. And afterwards, if you come up, Keeler, who's one of our hydrologists, brought samples of rock from the aquifers here in the Twin Cities, and you kind of get a sense of this is where your water is moving through. This is where it's coming from. Now, for some of you, and we'll talk more about that, you're getting your water from the Mississippi River, but a large proportion of us get our water from groundwater. So we're working on building this network. Now, this is 296 sites with 20 years of data. Keeler's been to every one of these. He's gone out and checked every one of them to make sure that he and some other staff, that they're actually producing good data. We now have 900 sites total, but we just don't have 20 years of data for all 900. So it takes 20 years to get a site with 20 years of data, right? So the urgency is to get these things going so that 20 years from now we're not going, what's going on over there, right? What's happening with our water level? All right. So water rights and water responsibilities, a quick orientation to our statutes. Mr. Carlson probably has got more familiarity with this than a lot of us as being a representative of the state of Minnesota. But for the rest of us, we try to keep it simple. And here's the basics. In Minnesota, water is a public resource. Nobody owns it. You have a right to use it up to a certain amount. So if you live along a lake or you live along a stream or you have groundwater underneath you, you can access that water. And our statutes say you can have up to 1 million gallons. You don't have to get a permit from the DNR. Up to 1 million gallons. Each individual riparian owner could use up to 1 million gallons without a permit from us. Anything beyond that, you have to get it. The state grants a right to use it. Beyond that, sort of what they call the personal use, and it's 1 million gallons. And then the DNR has to determine its availability, sustainability, and where do you fit in the priority system. So keep it simple. Domestic water supply is the highest priority use in the state. Agricultural irrigation and industrial processing fall down there in the middle. Guess where car washes and lawn watering fall? At the bottom, right? There's the lowest priority. So when we pump groundwater out of an aquifer, and an aquifer is just some material that if you put a pipe in it, water will flow into that pipe and you can pump it and actually get water. That's the definition of an aquifer. There's all kinds, shapes, varieties of aquifers, but when you pump out of an aquifer, essentially what you're doing is you're pulling water towards that pipe and you create this thing we call a cone of depression. So our job is, will that cone of depression from, in this case, let's say maybe it's an ethanol plant or an irrigation well, will it cause somebody's private well to be out of water? Will it cause contaminants to migrate into that well and make it so it's not safe to drink? Will it pull water away from that lake, river, stream, or wetland such that it's going to impact it negatively? That's the essence of the job that we have at the DNR, to figure out what's happening underground that you can't see, with a network of wells that doesn't have 20 years of data in most places, right? But you know, it's not just one cone of depression that we have to take in consideration. So this is in the Bonanza Valley. So cone of depression, cone of depression, cone of depression, right? Multiple cones of depression, some public land, some wetlands, areas, place people use for hunting, depends on water. You got a community water supply, you got a golf course, you got a waste treatment facility here, maybe returning some of that water. So we refer to it as it's the cumulative cones, not the individual cones. So in the reality, the simple example is we put a well in, we pump it, and our job in a simple case is to figure out, did we pull too much water away from the stream? Or just a little bit, and how did it impact the stream? But the reality is it looks a lot more like this, because we have multiple aquifers. We're pumping water out of a variety of aquifers. We're pumping it from a variety of distances, so that this pump turns on, maybe you see the effect on the stream in the next day or two. This one turns on and you didn't see it until 2 months later. This one, maybe it was 6 months later because it was down in a deeper aquifer and it took a while, but it pulled water from the superficial to recharge. Or it pulled it from a distance way, way over here off to the side. So it becomes very complicated very quickly. Well, you know, the point is we don't want to do this to our surface waters. We want our surface waters to have water, to support the ecosystems. With a land of 10,000 lakes and 100,000 some miles of rivers and streams, and I don't know how many acres left of wetlands, but we still have quite a few. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the Twin Cities, and I'm going to bring you right in here to this geography just for a little bit. Over time in the Twin Cities, we've changed the source of water that we're relying on. So Minneapolis and St. Paul have alluded to this. Minneapolis, St. Paul, and some surrounding communities rely on the Mississippi River to meet water supply. And you know, when we were a smaller suburban area, that was a real close by source, and it didn't take a whole lot. You didn't have to lay a lot of pipe to move the water where you needed to. And so we were 90% reliant on the Mississippi River for our water supply in the Twin Cities. But as the outer ring suburbs developed, they all developed using groundwater for the most part. And now our population here in the Twin Cities is about 70+% reliant on groundwater to meet our needs. Well, in the West Metro, not too far from where I live now, we've got a monitoring well, and this one is one of our best because it's got 60 some years of data, and what we see is a water level trend that's declining steadily downward. So the question is it sustainable? If the amount of water we draw levels off, if we don't keep increasing, maybe this will flatten out over time. But if we keep increasing, we can expect it'll keep decreasing. And then the question is, at what point do you get to the point where that aquifer no longer is yielding? Now, we're probably a ways away from that. But, you know, I've used the analogy, you know, you're driving down that rural highway, and you're really glad sometimes when there's that little flashing yellow light that says the signal's going to change ahead, prepare to stop. Because, you know, if you're going 60, 65 and you can't see the light, but it tells you, hey, be ready, slow down, you know, it gives you a little warning, right? This is kind of a flashing yellow light for us. We're not in the emergency room yet, But this is the sort of thing that California was ignoring for years. You know, they pumped their aquifers so hard the land has actually collapsed down, and those aquifers no longer can hold the water. In fact, in some places they've got poles that they show where the land used to be, and some of them, the land used to be as high as the ceiling in this room. That's how much it's subsided. And they had to start doing some things because some places were actually going below sea level when they were from pumping, where I went to college, in fact. Okay, so Keeler put these maps together for me. This red area over here is the St. Paul Regional Water Service area. So, you know, you got a few of the smaller communities outside of St. Paul that get their water from St. Paul, and most of that is river water. They have some groundwater they blend for temperature and taste issues during the summer months. Minneapolis here, supplying some of Bloomington, and of course, Golden Valley, New Hope, and Crystal get water supply from Minneapolis, which is coming from the river. But all the rest of these communities are on groundwater. So, and if you notice, down here in Eden Prairie, their wells are kind of concentrated in one area. Over here in Plymouth, you got a concentration of wells and a concentration of wells. Several scattered around Lake Minnetonka. The monitoring that I just showed you, that data was taken from over in this area. That was the 60-year data. Edina's network is pretty distributed. So now I'm going to show you some data from a monitoring well right up here in New Hope. And New Hope is not pumping groundwater to meet its water supply needs, right? But Plymouth is, and those wells are not too far away from this monitoring well. So what do we see? We see an up and down. And now because of these electronic devices, we don't go out and take a reading every month. We get readings every 15 minutes recorded that we can download and put on our computers and serve up to the public, and it's all available on our website. And you can see this kind of thing. So you can really watch it go up and down and up and down, right? There might be a downward trend here. It's hard to know because back during this time frame, we didn't have great data. We're getting better data. And this is what our network is starting to look like now all around the state because of these. But again, you see 20 or so feet of drop, and it's usually associated with our summertime pumping. One community that I'm familiar with on the east side of the metro has 17 or 18 wells in their network, okay, in their public water supply. They only need to pump 3 of them in January and February. They need 17 for 5 days a year. 5 days a year when the air temperatures are 90 plus degrees and it's 5 o'clock at night and people come home and turn water on like crazy and their peak demand goes boom through the roof. Then they got to have the whole system running. Now think about it. If you have 19 wells and if it costs you ballpark $1 million for every well you put in and well house and all the whatever goes on with that, and if you could get by with half of that because you didn't have a high peak demand, think how much money you save in your community and how much money you're not spending and not passing on to consumers in the utility bills, right? So there are some real costs when we start to think about our water use habits. So the Minneapolis system, they pump 24 million gallons a year, 25, is that billion? Billion gallons, yeah. About 25 billion gallons, well, about 80% goes right in Minneapolis. You folks get about 11.5% of that. Bloomington gets a small percentage, and we got Columbia Heights getting about 3%. So here's what we know about water use in communities. Older communities use less, typically because they have more trees, there's more shade, so you need less water on your lawn. New developing communities, boy, they're using it a lot, right? They come out, they develop, they scrape all the black dirt off, they build the house, they throw a few inches of black dirt back on, and they slip some sod across the thing, and they turn the hose on. And turn it on every day for every other day for, a while. It takes a long time to get it established, and then once the trees get bigger, the use starts to go down. Typical pattern that we see. We're going to add another 800,000 residents in this metropolitan area in the next 25 years, according to the Metropolitan Council. 800,000 more residences. Not all of them are going to be homes, and not all going to be single-family homes in the suburbs, obviously, but still, we're going to add another 800,000 people. That's like doubling the population of Minneapolis over again right here. Right? So we're going to use more water. All right, well, the legislature said, you know, we really ought to manage our water well, and they passed a law that said all public water suppliers over 1,000 people must implement demand reduction measures. And what they said is you need to reduce your water demand, you need to reduce your peak demand, you need to reduce water loss and non-essential use. So you can accomplish two of those things at the same time, because you can reduce your peak demand if you reduce your non-essential use, because the most non-essential use is lawn watering, and that's what drives the peak demand. So bang, if you curb those two things, you make a big difference. Water loss, this is the public works guy's responsibility. This is the leaky pipes that are underneath the ground everywhere. And some communities are losing as much as 40% of the water that they distribute never makes it to its end destination. The benchmark is 10%. Really good communities are at 5%. Rochester and a few others are apparently at 5%. Older communities, depends on what kind of material you're, like Richfield, for example, has very low water loss. Public Works guy told me it's because of the soils and this everything there, it's very stable. They don't get a lot of this movement, so they don't get the fractures in the pipes. And what they said is, you know, you're not going to be able to get new wells or increase your appropriation if you haven't done these things. So we're working with communities on their water supply plans. They're going to be due for renewal and updates here in the next 3 years. And these things all need to be in place, and they need to be working on it before they can increase what they're going to use, pump, whatever. All right, so what we're doing at the DNR is that we are heightening the priority given to this issue. I was talking to Representative Carlson earlier. I've been over to the legislature several times, well, dozens of times, over the last several years, sharing this kind of information with legislators to help them understand it. And I do a lot of public speaking to help other people understand what we're understanding. We're also working on our data. We're getting more and more data, but we've got a long way to go. We're working on improving our management. I talked about those cumulative cones. So the kind of analysis that it takes, the number of staff, the number of keelers I have to have that can do this work increases the more complex it is. So we were fortunate to get a budget increase, $6 million a year, 2 years ago. We got that budget increase, general fund, that we can put towards these kinds of things. We're also making sure people are getting their permits and they're reporting their water use accurately. So when we find people have a high volume well on the property and they don't have a permit, those are the people we go to talk to. Say, are you using that water? How much are you using? You know, maybe you need a permit. Working on our communication and education. I talked about our website a little bit. We're getting the data out there. We're also getting reports out there. I would suggest that you folks would be interested in 2 new reports, 3 actually. They're not even final yet, but they just got approved last week. One is the Environmental Quality Board's report. It's called Beyond the Status Quo Water Policy Report for Minnesota. And it talks about a number of things that we can do to move forward on some of our water challenges. Not just groundwater, but surface water and streams, water quality, all kinds of things. That report should be available on our website soon. Effectively addressing challenges in areas of high use. So I showed you some maps where we have really intensive use. 2 years ago, we initiated some pilot projects that we call groundwater management areas. What we wanted to do was get stakeholders, get the businesses, the municipalities, the local units of government, and citizens together in a room and talk with us about what kinds of things we needed to do for the next 5 years to make sure that the amount of water we're using is sustainable and that we're not impacting some streams or some wetlands or some lakes in those geographies. And we did that in the north and east metropolitan area, which includes White Bear Lake and a whole bunch of other communities and some trout streams along the St. Croix River. We've got one up in that, I showed you that air photo of the agricultural area, it's Bonanza Valley. So we've been from, if you're familiar with where Glenwood down to Paynesville, it's kind of that area of the state. And then the other one is up by Park Rapids. And so each of these have been meeting now for almost 2 years. We've got draft plans. We're working on final review and revisions of those. Our final meetings are coming up, and we're going to have groundwater management plans for each of those 3 areas by the end of the year that our commissioner will sign and then officially designate. And that's just committing us to a whole lot of work in those areas. And it plans for us, what we're going to do these things specifically in those geographies. And then promoting water conservation and wise use. I talked about that. Let me talk a little bit more. So our view is that if we can really understand how much water we can sustainably use in a given area, so if we know what the limit is, then we can figure out what we need to do. If we need more water, we can address it on the supply side. Diversify our sources. You guys are on the river. Other communities could use the river and not use groundwater, save the groundwater for when the river's not as available. The river gets low too, and sometimes it's a concern. So maybe we can do what we call a shared system, or a conjunctive is the technical term. Stormwater management and recharge. I'll talk a little bit about that. Or, heaven forbid, we take that water out of the treated facilities and we reuse it and have it do another job for us before we get rid of it, right? That dirty water. Southern California has a innovative system. They have a water supply that they sell bottled water, and it's called Porcelain Springs. It's true. They clean it up that well. And actually, we do too. Met Council has a facility in East Bethel. They treat that water to drinking water standards. And they've run it in a supply pipe up an area of the community that's slated to be developed for industrial and commercial growth. And they're going to need water for their businesses. And so when they build, they're going to have a supply available to them that meets drinking water standards. But for right now, what they're doing is they're discharging into a very sandy and gravel area and allowing it to infiltrate into the groundwater. So we even are doing that. But we can also deal with these things on the demand side, right? So it's not just about supply, it's also on demand. We talked about our demand. We can use water wisely. We can use less for lawns. We can change out our toilets. You get the low flush, the 2-button version, 1 or 2. You got all kinds of things you can do. Leak detection, let's not lose it. For agriculture, scheduling your irrigation. Only put it on when you need it and only as much as you need. They got all kinds of technology now, and we're enhancing the data that they need to know what to use. Crop selection, it makes a difference. What variety of corn or beans you use makes a difference how much water you need. And there's a lot of options. Those are just some of them. So I want to give you an example of the city of Woodbury. The city of Woodbury is a rapidly growing community, lots of that new turf grass going out. That's the community that has the 18 wells but only needs 3 during the winter. A third of their water use is for urban irrigation. These slides are from the city of Woodbury. The city engineer is a friend of mine, Clay Eccles, so I got them from him. And some things they're piloting right now is irrigation retrofits. They're working on smart control systems. There is a statute that says if you're going to do outdoor irrigation, you have to have a water sensor on your irrigation system. Nobody enforces it, but it's on the books. They have an intern working with the commercial folks to look at their irrigation. They're working on new construction using moisture sensors, and they're trying to figure out if the city might need to participate financially in that to actually get people to change and to move. And then they're also looking at, everybody's probably familiar with now you have the typical odd even when it gets dry and we're worried about things, so we put our restrictions on. Meaningless. Odd and even watering days. Doesn't do anything to conserve water. Because then people water every other day, whether they need it or not. It's human behavior. Well, it's the even day. I'm going to water today. They're looking at going to trash day +1. So if your trash day is Tuesday, you get to water that day and then maybe on Saturday. Or if it's Wednesday, you get Wednesday and Sunday. Or you use, so on and so forth. So cutting it back. And the other thing they did is they got a Clean Water Fund grant from the Land and Legacy Amendment, the sales tax increase. They got some money. They were doing some road work out here, and they got some money to capture that storm water, put it into a system that would be used to irrigate the golf course. And in the meantime, they were able to improve the quality of the water going to Colby Lake, which was impaired for phosphorus and nutrients. Because the water quality from storm water tends to carry with it quite a bit of phosphorus, and it creates algae problems in lakes. So what they did is they took this runoff, they captured it in some ponds, they built that. Now that's what they're using to irrigate the golf course, and this system is only there if they don't have any. So they went from a well, drinking water for irrigation, to storm water for irrigation. There's examples in Hugo. There's many other examples around the state that I'm aware of. Yes, sir?
There's an example in New Hope here of doing the same thing,
Oh.
where they're stormwater in an underground storage tank there, and then they're gonna
Yep.
irrigate their ball fields.
Yep. See a lot of that, especially in older developed communities where there isn't a lot of open space to do this sort of thing. So it's more expensive because now you got to have tanks, you got to tear everything up. But there are examples, absolutely. I know several.
Very expensive, but it also does water quality too.
Yep. Right. Exactly. Keep that phosphorus water out of your lakes, and then you get better quality.